Hi everyone, my name is John Kanagy and I want to welcome you to my backyard here in Napa, California. I want to talk to you today a little bit about some tips that I've learned about climate-friendly gardening. I want to start by really briefly saying what our climate situation is. As you know, we have a climate change problem, and that's based around the balance of carbon. Carbon is an element that is in huge supply in the soil and in living plants, in animals, and ourselves. But over the many millennia of human activity, that carbon has kind of shifted from being in the soil and in reserves of coal and oil, things like that, and been in the form of carbon dioxide in the air, which is creating a sort of a greenhouse effect that is warming the earth. Let's think a little bit about what gardeners can do. We have a couple of options. We want to capture carbon, sequester it, we call it, capture it and keep it here on Earth and in our soil. One thing we can do, of course, is plant trees, something that we are pretty good at as gardeners, and other plants, but trees are going to be the biggest source of carbon, or a sink of carbon that we can use. But probably more important than that is increasing the carbon in our soil with soil organic matter. Let me show you a few things that I do in the vegetable garden. So there's a lot that we can do to put more carbon into the soil and have less in the atmosphere. We can incorporate carbon into the soil by using compost, and simply growing plants will contribute carbon to the soil. A problem that we have as gardeners and as farmers is that if we're continually cultivating the soil, it mixes air with the soil, and that stimulates microorganisms that eat that organic matter, and some of that is good. We need that because it also releases nutrients and things. But if that gets going too much, then we lose a lot of organic matter to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So we want to minimize cultivation, and if we can, keep the soil covered as well. So I use a lot of straw mulch, like you see here, to cover, say, these tomatoes. I'll put it over here as well once these corn plants get a little bit taller. Another thing that we can do to minimize the need for cultivation in these vegetable beds is don't walk on them ever. So I have raised beds, as much as anything, just to sort of delineate where to walk and where to stay away. I use a bark mulch that I get for free from a tree company on all of the pathways, and then as much as is possible, use straw mulch to cover the vegetable beds. There's a lot of other advantages to this. Of course, conserves moisture, something that's very important now in particular. But also feeds earthworms. It, often if it's compost, it provides some organic fertilizer as well. So we get a lot of benefits from keeping the soil covered. All right, so we've talked about two things that we can do as gardeners. We can plant more trees. That's great, but it's going to be a little bit limited how much we can contribute there, just because of the size of our properties. We can do a lot with improving soil with organic fertilizers, like compost I make here in a compost pile, but there's also options of buying it by the bag or buying it by the truckload and having it brought to your place. So we can make a lot of improvement there. And the third thing I want to really emphasize is conserving energy in our landscapes. We can do that in a couple of ways. First of all, we can conserve water. You're like, yeah, wait a minute, that's a different subject. It isn't, because 20% of California's energy needs are used to move water around and to heat it. And we're not heating water in the garden, but we are moving water around. If water comes to your garden, unless you collected it off of your roof or something, it was pumped to you somehow or moved from some other watershed. And so the more we can conserve water, we'll save a lot of energy that results in less greenhouse gas emissions. Another thing is how we design landscapes. For one thing, I found this statistic the other day, 5% of the United States greenhouse gas emissions are because of mowing lawns. We don't need that many lawns. Most of the lawns that we have are not being used. They're to look at, and that's just not a worthwhile result. Now, I think a lawn is appropriate. I have a small one over here because there's no better surface for running around with the kids and playing games and things. Our kids are getting old enough that we're beginning to think that maybe the time has come for our lawn to be replaced. We did the whole front lawn, converted to a drought-tolerant landscape, and so maybe it's time for the back lawn as well. Another thing I wanted to point out in this setting here is this hedge, very tall hedge of Ladybank's rose. It was planted probably 30 or 40 years ago, because we've been here for 20 years and it's always been this big. This is a plant that wants to be 10 feet tall and maybe 15 or 20 feet wide at the base, but whoever planted it just 3 or 4 feet from the street. So that means that I have to, with a hedge trimmer, cut all of that material off 4 or 5 times a year to keep it from encroaching too much on the street. That material then has to be, I can't compost that, it's just too big and woody. So it goes into the yard waste bins and gets trucked down, burning diesel, to a composting facility. That's a great thing, making compost, but that requires big machines to chip that up and to turn it into compost to be trucked away to some other site. So we need to design our landscapes so they don't require so much hedging and trimming and mowing and things like that, and we can save a lot of energy that way. I'm just going to close with the idea of treating carbon as sort of a precious resource that you have on your property, so that even the scraps in your kitchen are coming to the compost pile, wastes from the garden. If you have enough space that you can have chickens and things, and there's another place that the bigger scraps can go, things like your tomato plants and corn plants. Treat carbon jealously. You want to keep it on your property. And that's going to work for all of us to reduce the climate change problem.